வெல்கம் பேக். பிபிசியினுடைய முன்னாள் செய்தியாளர், இலங்கைக்கான செய்தியாளர் பிரான்சிஸ் ஹாரிசன் அவர்களுடன் நாம் இப்போது இலங்கையில் 7 வருடங்களின் பின்னர், யுத்தம் நடந்த 7 வருடங்களின் பின்னர் இலங்கையில் காணப்பட்ட நிலைமைகளும் சர்வதேச அரங்கில் அது ஏற்படுத்தி வரும் எதிரொலிகளும் அதிர்வலைகளும் தமிழருக்கு சாதகமாக இருக்கிறதா அல்லது தமிழர்களது நீதி பயணத்தில், நீதி போராட்டத்தில் பொறுப்பு கூறும் பொறிமுறையை பொறுத்தவரையில் அது எந்த அளவுக்கு இப்போது நாம் முன்னகர்ந்து நிற்கிறோம் அல்லது 7 வருடங்களின் பின்னையும் அந்த இடத்தில் தான் நிற்கிறோமா என்பது குறித்து அவர்கள் நாம் விரிவாக கலந்துரையாடி வருகிறோம். பிரான்சிஸ், as you said, earlier you have spoken to a lot of people to write the book. Have you stopped? Now you have finished writing the book. Have you stopped looking for details? Or there are still people who want to talk to you?
There's still people we want to talk to. I don't know if they want to talk to us. But yes, we have recently been doing, I don't know if you know, I've been involved in documenting post-war torture and sexual violence. But in the most recent months, myself and my colleagues have been doing a very modest consultation exercise amongst exiled victims from Sri Lanka. So when I say exiled victims, they're very recent post-war people who've left post-war. Okay. So they've either been through Mulawaikul or they've been through detention and torture and white van abduction and so on. And there are about 75 people we've spoken to in 4 countries. And I wish we could do more because it's interesting to do, but it had to be kind of limited. And these were one-on-one interviews. And I think what struck us from this was the extraordinarily kind of awful images, really. I mean, real horror from this war. And, I'm somebody who spent ages reading hundreds of accounts or listening to them, and I have to say they were shocking. Every single one is shocking. But this was different because we didn't ask people to give a chronology of, what happened then where did you go, then all that. We just said, okay, what do you remember as traumatic incidents? And what they told us was the stuff of their nightmares, the things, the images, the memories they couldn't get out of their heads. And it was very personal, the things that affected people, but they were absolutely horrific. People described children wiping human blood off food and eating it because they were so hungry. Or, as you know, people walking through the lagoon and drinking the water and all this sort of stuff, water with dead bodies in. But also people describing, sitting and eating and then, the brains of somebody landing on next to them, or bits of, body parts everywhere, having to bury people who are still warm in bunkers because they had to move on. And, of course, the huge trauma of having to abandon people without burying them properly or when they were injured, something that people find it very, very difficult to move beyond. And you can understand why.
They had to make quick decisions, isn't it?
They were under fire, and if they didn't move, they'd all be dead. So, you can't blame them in a way, but Absolutely. It's not something people can move on from very easily. They find that very distressing to remember, especially if it's their loved ones. So, that the degree of trauma and horror that individuals experienced, I mean, every single survivor, normally as a journalist with a war and refugees and so on, you get 1 or 2 or 3 very strong stories and the others are not so strong. But with Mulawaikul, anybody you talk to who went through it has the most shocking, horrific memories and stories of what happened to them. And I think, we started to capture some of those things, and I've personally found them very shocking. I mean, quite, distressing just to read, let alone, be the person that experienced that. So those things are forever with people, So you have, for example, one thing that struck me was a kind of hardened LTT cadre talking about how on the 13th of May, when the Mulawaikul hospital was attacked, he saw a female cadre, kind of colleague, her whole family being killed in that incident. And she was just holding the bodies one by one and kind of weeping and crying. And there was just nothing he could do to comfort her or to help her. And, her whole family being killed in that incident. And somehow, what he found, although, he'd suffered torture after the war and a lot of bereavement and, extraordinary amount of suffering himself, what stuck in his mind was this girl and how she was holding up the dead one by one and holding them and crying. So, those sort of images are very powerful, and there are so many of them.
Francis, the other controversial issue is about the creation of no-fire zone. What do you hear from people, or the witnesses, or survivors, about the no-fire zone?
Well, I think, I've written about it in my book about the choice of the placement of the first no-fire zone. It was highly controversial, and arguably it should have been on the beach at the beginning so that you could separate fighters and civilians. It wasn't like that, and it was unilaterally declared by the army. It wasn't negotiated with anybody. But I think it was, apart from everything else, it was aimed at neutralising or knocking out the LTT heavy guns, because they were in the no-fire zone as it was declared. So it made it very difficult for them to use them and fire them out, and also to move them around. And there was one artillery commander we interviewed who talked about how they had the shells buried underground.
From the LTT side, right?
Yes, from the LTT side. And there aren't many artillery commanders left from the LTT side, so they're few and far between. But he described how they buried the shells for these guns underground, and then once the no-fire zone was announced, suddenly these huge numbers of civilians swarmed into the area, started putting tents on top of the area where they'd buried the shells. And he remembered this conversation with this woman where he said, well, no, madam, you can't put your tent there. And she was like, no, but haven't you heard? This is safe. This is a safe zone. So, very difficult to maneuver and to function with your heavy artillery in an environment where there's civilians everywhere. For no other reason also that you want them to be secret, their location. You don't want everyone to know where your guns are. So he described, real problems moving them. They had to move them at night on the main road. They couldn't go through the jungle. It became more and more difficult to operate these guns as they got pushed further and further and back and more enclosed with civilians. So this argument that, the LTT was still firing out heavy artillery, became less and less accurate, as you went further into the months of the war, because obviously they didn't have them.
Because too close, isn't it?
Well, that's another thing. I mean, they kind of lost them and abandoned them as the months went by, but certainly, when you look at some of the hospital incidents, the PTK hospital, PTK hospital and the SLA lines are so close that you couldn't have fired from the hospital and hit the SLA. There's a trajectory when you fire, so you'd have had to have been further back in order to fire. So that's my understanding. I'm not a military person, but I think there are some serious questions about this argument that the government keeps putting forward that we were just responding to LTT artillery fire. I think there's quite a bit that scientifically could be done to examine that. And of course, if we'd had access forensically to the sites at the time, then it could have been properly examined, but not now. But also, on top of that, we have witnesses, and these are not only Tamil witnesses, there are Sinhalese witnesses, and there are international witnesses who've been in some of these sites and who didn't see heavy gun positions in hospitals, for example.
You have interviewed one of those UN guy who has worked there, and he said the UN has completely failed. I mean, are the UN workers still maintain that the UN has failed?
It said grave failures, didn't it? I mean, Petri said there were grave failures in Sri Lanka, that the UN hadn't learned from the mistakes of Rwanda. So I don't think that this is a glorious episode in the UN's history at all. And in fact, the Rights Up Front movement in the UN, which is supposed to put human rights at the forefront of what the UN does, emerged because of the experience of Sri Lanka and because of the Charles Petrie report. I mean, you can argue whether that's made any difference in Sri Lanka itself, and it's a slow process and it has to take hold. It takes a while before those sort of initiatives have any impact, but I think it's a positive thing that it's come out of that. That's an acknowledgement that there were terrible mistakes by the UN in 2009. And I mean, terrible mistakes, it's not only the expatriate staff from the UN who were in the field who, suffered basically from what happened. The Tamil UN staff, some of them are still struggling to get to safety and to be secure. I mean, I know some around Europe who, really haven't been looked after by the UN at all, and that's frankly a disgrace. People who've been tortured, people who've had to flee, people who still don't have asylum, and why the UN has not done more for those people. They wash their hands of them. They shouldn't have. They should have looked after those people.
So has UN done enough? There's a UN inquiry, UN Human Rights High Commission inquiry. Do you think the UN has done enough to rectify their mistakes of the past? At least the mistake they have done, they have committed, and as a result, thousands of people were killed. Obviously, the parties to the conflict were responsible for the killings, but as a UN has its own mandate in protecting the civilians. So in establishing the justice, so it's established the accountability process. Do you think UN has done enough?
Well, I think you have to differentiate different bits of the UN, right? And I mean, the UN is only as good as the member states, especially the Human Rights Council. So obviously, I don't think so. But, you know, you can't blame the UN as an institution for some of that. Some of that is, you know, what the Human Rights Council mandates them to do. So if you look at last year's resolution, was it strong enough? No, I would have liked it to be as strong as the recommendations in the UN report itself. If you read the OISL report, the recommendations are very strong and they're very good. Did that translate itself into the resolution? No, not entirely. I mean, bits of it are there, but not all of it, and not strong enough. But that's not the UN staff's fault, is it? That's the Human Rights Council, the member states, the politics, the geopolitics that makes that happen. If you're looking at UN staff and whether they're proactive enough on the issues of human rights in Sri Lanka, I mean, I think it depends on which bits you're talking about. There's always a tension between the human rights people and the development people.
But for the victim, UN is the UN. They don't look at whether they are from UNDP or UN.
No, I understand, and they don't differentiate between the international community and the UN.
Yeah.
So I'm answering your question, but I think you have to break it up if you're assigning responsibility or blame, because that's only fair. I mean, you wouldn't want to be blamed for all TV journalists' problems, right?
But it's the expectation of the people. They say that when UN Human Rights High Commissioner postponed the releasing of the report, they said don't repeat the mistakes of the past of 2009. But again, now he went to Sri Lanka, and it almost ended up like a PR exercise, and the government has won a diplomatic war. And you see now, even last week, the special rapporteurs on torture and justice process have gone, and it appears that the government is scoring some points, but the victims are not very happy that this process is being established.
Okay, I mean, personally, I'd like the UN to be very outspoken about these issues, but I would say that I think Juan Mendes, the Special Rapporteur on Torture, what I saw of what he said at the end of his visit was very strong. He's a torture survivor himself from Argentina, and he's been around, he's seen a lot of these done a lot of these prison visits and so on. And I think what he came up with was very strong and very brave, and really set the agenda for the rest of the UN. Now it makes it very difficult for the UN to ignore the sort of ongoing violations that he spoke about. And what he said about the prison conditions was, by any standards, quite shocking. He said he struggled to find adjectives to describe. Appalling didn't do it. So I mean, I'm quite happy with how he responded and how he went on that visit and what he said at the end of it. And obviously that's not the end of it, because he reports next year. He'll continue to, investigate and to study the problem and report back to the council. So I think that's really good. But, if you're asking me whether the High Commissioner for Human Rights should have been more outspoken when he went to Sri Lanka, personally I would have liked it if he were more outspoken. But, I guess they take a strategic political approach. They decide, when to push, when not to push. They push behind closed doors. They don't always do it in public. These are the ways these organisations work.
Function.
Yeah, so different people have different roles. Some people push harder, like the rapporteurs. Other people have to engage. And I think, what you're seeing at the moment is the entire international community wanting to engage with the Sri Lankan government on the assumption they think that this government is better than the previous one, and they want to try and push it in the right direction.
But the engagement is more on the business side, isn't it? On the trade and business side than the human rights side.
Well, I think it's both, because there's a big push on the transitional justice stuff as well. So I think it's both. But obviously motivated by, political interest of individual countries. That's how, foreign policy works, right? So I think, I think that is a big change, and there are some things happening that, open things up. But if you want a pure human rights kind of hard international pressure approach, that's not happening at the moment.
Francis, another important issue that has happened, the important event or incident that has happened within the no-fire zone or towards the end of the war is that the white flag surrendering. I spoke to I had an interview with the former Norwegian peace envoy Erik Solheim when he came to UK, and this is what he said.
We of course informed the government of Sri Lanka about this. We were not alone on this, because Puludevan also called others. So we informed the government of Sri Lanka, others did that. And the next morning we got the information that they were dead. Exactly what happened, I cannot tell. but because I'm in not the slightest doubt that they were deliberately killed by the Sri Lankan armed forces.
Whom did you inform on the Sri Lankan side? You said you were in touch with the
We
government.
informed Basir Rajapaksa.
Okay, what was his response?
That they noted this, and I can't exactly recall because I didn't speak to him personally, but they noted this and they will act accordingly.
Now that you are involved in...
Whether some promise was given, I've seen in the media that someone claimed that the government of Sri Lanka made a promise that
They were talking about Vijay Nambiar.
Yeah, on that matter I cannot tell Nambiar. I have to explain that. But I think that, again, we know what you need to know, that they offered to hand themselves over. They were ready to do that, and they were deliberately killed.
Now that there's a process started about this war crime process, inquiry, whether it's domestic or international or even hybrid, you were involved, at least in the know about what was happening during the final stage of the war, and you were in touch with both the parties to least. Will you give witness in this regard, in this white flag surrender?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I've already given witness to the UN Commission working on this. I give witness to American investigations. I'm ready to speak to any serious investigation, whether it's national, domestic in Sri Lanka, or international. But it's also important to note that also P.Karunakharan has said.
Francis, Pulidevan, you were one of the outside people. Pulidevan has been in touch. What do you know about this white flag surrendering?
I think, as Mr. Solheim said, it was one of the most well-publicised surrenders at the time. Everybody seems to have known in Colombo and many people abroad, and diplomats, government officials, that they intended to surrender. And I don't think any of the government explanations for why they ended up dead make any sense. I mean, the idea that they were shot in the back by their own people is ludicrous, and there are many eyewitnesses to refute that. And the idea that they were somehow killed in crossfire, that there was fierce fighting at that particular point at the bridge on the 18th of May is nonsense, because there were so many civilians crossing over at that point. So, you know, I think he's right that there's no doubt in my mind that they were executed after successfully surrendering. But, you know, we haven't got video of the actual execution. We don't know, you know, who committed the act. But I cannot believe that in an area as militarized and as under control and command as that area south of the Vatavakal Bridge, that would happen without the explicit orders and knowledge of the entire military command.
No, but what I say is, was Puli in touch with you in that time?
He wasn't in touch with me after the 13th of May. No.
What was his? What he told you when he spoke to you last? In terms of the fightings.
I mean, you know, we had on and off discussed surrender, or, you know, escape, and you remember there were all those rumours about Puli being in Switzerland and so on. We had endless jokes. He joked a lot about everything, even in those circumstances, and he would joke about, you know, I'd say, "Where are you?" and he'd say, "Oh, I'm in Switzerland," and of course he wasn't. Yeah. So there was some discussion about that, and it always puzzled me why the LTT never got any of their top people out, you know, political people. Because, you know, theoretically it could have been possible. And they didn't seem to have a plan B, as it were, at that point. And I was always surprised by that. And I think we didn't discuss the specific surrender on the 18th of May. Yeah. I know that he discussed that with other people abroad and, you know, in different countries. You know, there were a lot of communications, but I wasn't part of that.
I think we are coming to an end. Tell me briefly, the June is coming. The Sri Lankan government has to give a verbal account at the UN Human Rights Council. What do you expect them to give, and what do you expect the international community to do?
I think what the Sri Lankan government will say is very much the sort of things that the Foreign Minister has been saying in meetings, you know, lists of things like we sang the national anthem in Tamil, that kind of stuff. We invited the special rapporteurs, you know, the High Commissioner came, etc. All of which kind of tick boxes in a way. But there's still this real underlying question of whether they're going to get to the issue of accountability, proper accountability for what happened. And then in terms of the international community, I suspect they will, you know, push a bit, but not that hard, because it's still June. There's still, even if some countries and some players have doubts about the sincerity of the government, I think they'll probably give them a bit more time. It's likely, isn't it? And it'll be next year in March that the kind of crunch point will come where people will get frustrated with Sri Lanka if it hasn't delivered.
So till then the victims have to wait.
7 years. You're going to be asking me this in another few years from now. I mean, it is appalling for the victims to have to wait so long and to have no hope of going home in the case of the exiles, or having justice, or even knowing where their family members are for the ones who've disappeared. I mean, the suffering you see amongst the survivors of Mulawaikul is just out of this world. I mean, it's extraordinary how people, they're like the living dead. They're sort of walking, you know, and surviving, but guilty to be alive, but having endured things that you and I can hardly imagine.
Francis, on that note, we had to wind up today's program. அதாவது எதிர்வரும் ஜூன் மாதத்தில் இலங்கை அரசாங்கம் ஐநா மனித உரிமை பேரவையில் ஜெனீவாவில் ஒரு வாய்மொழி அறிக்கை சமர்ப்பிக்க இருக்கிறது. இதில் இலங்கை அரசாங்கம் சில காத்திரமான நடவடிக்கைகள் எடுத்திருக்கிறது. ஆனாலும் அது பேரளவுக்கு மட்டுமே காத்திரமான நடவடிக்கைகளாக காணப்படுகிறதே தவிர போரினால் பாதிக்கப்பட்ட மக்களது நீதி நிலைநாட்டுவதற்காகவோ அல்லது அவர்கள் நலன்களை பாதுகாப்பதற்காகவோ அல்லது நலன்களை உறுதிப்படுத்துவதாகவோ அது அமையவில்லை என்றும் சர்வதேச சமூகம் இப்போதைக்கு இலங்கையை பொறுத்தவரையில் ஒரு பொறுத்திருந்து பார்ப்போம், இந்த நல்ல அரசாங்கத்து என்று சொல்லப்படுகிற அரசாங்கத்துக்கு ஒரு கால இடைவெளியை கொடுக்க வேண்டும் என்ற ஒரு நிலைப்பாட்டைத்தான் கடைப்பிடிக்கப் போகிறது, தொடர்ந்தும் கடைப்பிடிக்கப் போகிறது. பாதிக்கப்பட்ட மக்களை பொறுத்தவரை தொடர்ந்தும் இது ஒரு காத்திருப்பாகத்தான் இருக்க போகிறது. மிகவும் உலகிலே சொல்ல முடியாத அளவுக்கு மிகவும் கோரமான யுத்தத்தையும் அதன் பின்னரான விளைவுகளை சந்தித்த மக்கள் பெருமளவு உடல் ரீதியாகவும் உள ரீதியாகவும் பாதிக்கப்பட்டிருக்கிறார்கள். அந்த மக்கள் அதாவது இப்போது நாங்கள் 7வது வருடத்தை நிறைவேற்றிருக்கிறது. ஆனால் அவர் பிரான்சிஸ் அரசன் சொல்லுகிறார், இன்னும் பல வருடங்கள் சென்றாலும் இந்த மாதிரியான வினாக்களும் சந்தேகங்களும் தொடர்ந்து நிலவத்தான் போகிறது. இதற்கு சர்வதேச சமூகமும் இலங்கை அரசாங்கமும் காத்திரமான நடவடிக்கை எடுப்பதற்கான வாய்ப்புகள் குறைவு என்ற சந்தேகத்தை அவர் வெளியிடுகிறார். நல்லது நேயர்களே, தொடர் நிகழ்ச்சியை நிறைவு செய்து கொள்கிறோம். உங்களோட விடைபெற்றுக் கொண்டு நான் P.Karunakharan. நன்றி, வணக்கம். Thanks, Francis. Thanks a lot.